At 11:32 on the morning of November 29th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Roscoe Thatcher knelt in the tail section of a B-17 flying fortress named Devil's Chariot, watching German fighters swarm toward his bomber like angry hornets. 19 years old, a farm boy from Bayfield, Wisconsin, his first combat mission over a heavily defended target. The 8th Air Force had sent over 300 bombers to destroy Bremen's factories that morning. German defenders had already shot down 6 flying fortresses in the first hour. Ross's position was the loneliest on the aircraft. The tail gunner sat at the very back of the bomber, separated from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage. His only company was a pair of .50 caliber machine guns and the German fighters trying to kill him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story doesn't begin in the sky over Germany. It begins 18 months earlier, in a place about as far from war as a man could get. Bayfield, Wisconsin, summer, 1942. Bayfield sat on the southern shore of Lake Superior, a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes. Population barely broke 1,000. The Thatcher farm lay 3 miles outside town, 200 acres of dairy cows and hay fields that had belonged to Ross's grandfather and his grandfather before that. Ross Thatcher stood in the barn that Sunday afternoon, pitchfork in hand, moving hay from the loft. Sweat soaked through his work shirt. August heat, the kind that made everything slow down except the flies. The radio crackled from the farmhouse kitchen. His mother had left it on after church, WGN out of Chicago, playing big band music between news bulletins about the war in Europe. Ross barely paid attention anymore. The war had been going on for 3 years. It seemed as distant as the moon. He was 17, strong from farm work, lean muscle over a 6-foot frame, hands already calloused from handling tools and livestock, dark hair that wouldn't stay combed no matter how much Brill cream his mother insisted he use, blue eyes that most folks said looked just like his father's. His father had died 2 winters back. Heart gave out while fixing a fence post in a snowstorm. Found him frozen the next morning, still holding the wire cutters. Now it was just Ross and his mother. She didn't say much, but Ross knew what she was thinking every time she looked at him. He was all she had left. The screen door slammed. Willa Mae Brennan came around the corner of the barn, wearing a yellow sundress that her mother would have said was too nice for a farm visit. She didn't care. Willa Mae never cared much about what her mother thought. "Your ma said you were hiding out here," she called up to the loft. "Not hiding, working." "Same thing with you." Ross climbed down the ladder, brushing hay from his shoulders. Willa Mae was 18, a year younger than him, though she acted like she'd already figured out the entire world while the rest of them were still reading the manual. Strawberry blonde hair, freckles across her nose, a smile that could make him forget whatever he'd been worried about. They'd known each other since they were kids. Started holding hands at the county fair 2 summers ago. By last spring, everyone in Bayfield assumed they'd get married once Ross took over the farm. "Walk with me," she said. They walked toward the lake, following the dirt road that cut through the Thatcher property. Lake Superior stretched out grey-blue and endless. The Apostle Islands dotted the horizon like distant ships. "You hear about the Carlson boy?" Willa Mae asked. "Which one?" "Tommy, enlisted last week. Army Air Forces," Ross had heard. Ross had. Tommy Carlson was 2 years older, worked at the timber mill. Not particularly bright, not particularly ambitious, but he'd walked into the recruitment office in Duluth and signed his name, and now he was headed to basic training. "Half the boys from the county are signing up," Willa Mae continued. "My brother says it's our duty, says we can't just let Hitler take over the whole world." Ross picked up a stone and skipped it across the water. 3 skips before it sank. "Your brother talks too much." "Maybe, but he's not wrong." They walked in silence for a while. A bald eagle circled overhead, riding the thermals. Somewhere across the lake, Canada sat invisible beyond the curve of the earth. "What are you thinking?" Willamay finally asked. "That I'm thinking too much." She stopped walking, turned to face him, put both hands on his chest. "Ross Thatcher, you are the stubbornest, most tight-lipped man I've ever known, and I've known you your whole life, so I'm going to say what we're both thinking. You want to go, don't you?" He looked out at the lake. Your mother is stronger than you think, and she'd be proud of you, just like your father would have been. I'm all she has, which is exactly why you have to go. Because if you don't, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you were a coward, and that'll kill you worse than any German bullet. She was right. She was always right. November 10th, 1942, Ross's 18th birthday. His mother made him a chocolate cake. She didn't say anything about the papers he'd gotten from the recruitment office, even though he knew she'd found them in his dresser drawer. She just set the cake on the kitchen table and cut him a slice. "Your father and I," she said quietly, "we always knew you'd do something important with your life." "Ma, let me finish." She put down the knife. "You're a good boy, Ross. You work hard. You never complain. You've kept this farm running since your father died, and you're only 17, only 18 now." She smiled, but her eyes were wet. "If you need to go, then you go. I'll manage. The Brennans will help. Old Hank down the road already said he'd look after the cows if needed." Ross couldn't speak. He just nodded. The next morning, he drove the truck to Duluth. The recruitment office sat above a hardware store on Superior Street. A poster in the window showed a B-17 bomber flying through clouds, "Become an Army aviator." Inside, a sergeant with thick glasses looked him up and down. Height? 6 foot even. Weight? 150. Education? Finished high school last spring. The sergeant stamped a form. "You'll do. Sign here." That was it. 3 minutes, and his life changed forever. Harlingen, Texas, April 1943. Gunnery school. 6 weeks learning to shoot at targets pulled by other airplanes. 6 weeks learning to strip and reassemble a Browning .50 caliber machine gun blindfolded. 6 weeks learning to identify German aircraft at 2,000 yards. Messerschmitt, Bf 109, angular nose, squared-off wingtips. Focke-Wulf 190, radial engine, menacing profile. Junkers 88, twin-engine bomber often used as a night fighter. The instructors were men who'd already been to war, already seen what happened when you didn't shoot fast enough or aim true enough. They didn't waste time on encouragement. "Half of you won't make it home," one sergeant said, matter-of-factly. "The other half will wish you hadn't." Ross excelled. Farm boy reflexes, years of shooting rabbits and grouse in the Wisconsin woods, translated to tracking fast-moving targets. His hands never shook. His eyes never wavered. The instructors noticed. "Thatcher," one called out after a particularly good run on the range. "You ever think about being a tail gunner?" "What's the difference?" Tail gunner sits alone at the back of the aircraft, most dangerous position on the plane. Also the most important, German fighters love attacking from behind. You're the only thing stopping them. Sounds lonely? It is. That's why most boys can't handle it. But you don't seem like most boys. Ross thought about it, thought about the farm, thought about those long winter days fixing fence alone, miles from the nearest neighbor. "I'll take it." The sergeant smiled, not a happy smile, a knowing one. "Good, because we need boys who can sit alone in the dark and not lose their minds." Snetterton Heath, England, October 1943. The airbase sat in the flat farmland of Norfolk. 50 miles northeast of London. Rows of Nissen huts, mud everywhere from the constant rain, the smell of aviation fuel and cigarette smoke. This was the 96th Bomb Group. Heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, each one carried a crew of 10 men and enough bombs to level a city block. Ross met his crew on a cold October morning. The pilot gathered them around their assigned aircraft, a battle-scarred B-17 that had already flown 8 missions. Captain Frank Morrison was 28, ancient by aircrew standards. Tall, thin, with the calm voice of a man who'd taught high school math before the war. He had a wife and 2 daughters back in Pennsylvania. Carried their picture in his breast pocket. Showed it to the crew once, then never mentioned them again. Some things you kept close. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, "we are now a crew. That means we live together or we die together. There is no in-between." He pointed at each man in turn. Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, co-pilot, 24. Hot-tempered Irishman from Boston. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, navigator, 22, MIT graduate. Sharp mind, steady hands, soft-spoken. Lieutenant Edward Eddie Carlisle, bombardier, 22, talked too much when he was nervous, which was always. Sergeant Michael O'Reilly, flight engineer and top turret gunner, 26, former mechanic, could fix anything with wire and hope. Sergeant Anthony Russo, radio operator, 21, opera singer before the war, sometimes hummed Puccini on the intercom. Sergeant William Jackson, ball turret gunner, 19, smallest man on the crew at 5'4", fit perfectly in the cramped ball turret. Sergeant Richard Davis, right waist gunner, 25, former boxer, hands like hammers. Sergeant Henry Peterson, left waist gunner, 23, Minnesota farmer, quiet like Ross. And Ross, tail gunner, youngest, except for Jackson. "Our aircraft needs a name," Morrison continued. "Suggestions?" "Liberty Bell," someone offered. "Hell's Angel." "Memphis Gal," Ross spoke up from the back. "How about Devil's Chariot?" The crew went quiet. Morrison smiled. "Devil's Chariot. I like it. We're hauling hell to the Germans, might as well announce it." They painted the name on the nose that afternoon. Black letters 3 feet high, a cartoon devil riding a bomb. The first mission was a milk run. Light resistance over France. They dropped their bombs on a railway yard and came home without seeing a single enemy fighter. The second mission was worse. Flak over the target. Shrapnel tore through the fuselage. Davis, the waist gunner, took fragments in his leg, screamed all the way back to England. The third mission, they lost a bomber from their squadron. Direct hit from anti-aircraft fire, exploded in a fireball, no parachutes. The fourth mission, the fifth, the sixth. Each time Ross sat in his tail position alone, watching the sky behind them, watching for the fighters that would come screaming out of the sun, guns blazing. Each time they made it home. By November, Devil's Chariot had completed 12 missions. The magic number was 25. Complete 25 missions and you could go home, rotate back to the States, train new crews, never see Germany again. 13 more to go. The mathematics of survival were brutal. The average bomber crew lasted 15 missions. Some groups were losing half their aircraft every month. 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon during the raid on Schweinfurt 2 months earlier. Ross did the math in his head. 12 missions down, 13 to go. They were already beating the odds. That should have made him feel better. It didn't. November 28th, 1943. The night before Bremen. The mess hall served powdered eggs and weak coffee. The crews ate in near silence. Everyone knew what was coming. The intelligence officers had been tight-lipped all week, which meant something big. After dinner, Ross walked to the flight line, stood under the wing of Devil's Chariot, smoking a cigarette he'd bummed off one of the ground crew. Eddie Carlisle, the bombardier, walked over. His hands were shaking. They always did before a mission. "You ever think about what happens if we don't make it?" Eddie asked. "No point thinking about it." "Yeah, but what if—" "Then we don't make it. Thinking about it won't change anything." Eddie nodded, lit his own cigarette with shaking hands. "My girl back home," he said quietly. "She's pregnant, doesn't know I know. Her sister let it slip in a letter last month. I haven't said anything. Figured I'd surprise her when I get home." Ross didn't know what to say to that. "You got a girl?" Eddie asked. "Yeah." "What's her name?" "Willa May." "That's a nice name. You gonna marry her?" "If I make it home," Eddie laughed, a short, barking sound. When you make it home." "Sure, when?" They stood in silence, watching the mechanics work on the bombers under floodlights, changing oil, patching holes, loading ammunition belts. "Hey, Ross." "Yeah?" "If something happens tomorrow, if I don't make it, tell them I wasn't scared. Tell my girl. Tell her I knew about the baby. Tell her I was coming home to them." Ross looked at him. Really looked at him. This kid with his Boston accent and his pregnant girlfriend and his hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "You'll tell them yourself, Eddie." But Eddie just smiled sadly. "Yeah, maybe." He walked away into the darkness. Ross watched him go. Some promises you know you can't keep. November the 29th, 1943, 6:30 hours. The wake-up call came before dawn. Ross dressed in the dark. Long underwear, wool uniform, leather flight jacket, heated flight suit over everything. At 24,000 feet, the temperature would drop to 43 degrees below zero. Briefing at 0700. The crews filed into a Nissan hut, standing room only. 200 men about to climb into 50 bombers. The intelligence officer pulled back a curtain, revealing a large map of Europe. A red line stretched from England across the North Sea, deep into Germany. "Gentlemen, your target today is Bremen." A murmur ran through the room. Bremen. One of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, surrounded by flak batteries and fighter bases. Expected enemy resistance, heavy. Luftwaffe has approximately 150 fighters in the area. Flak will be intense over the target. Flight time, 4 hours out, 4 hours back. Weather, clear skies, good visibility. He said the last part like it was good news. It wasn't. Clear skies meant the German fighters could see them coming from 50 miles away. Any questions? No one spoke. What was there to ask? You flew the mission or you didn't. You lived or you died. Dismissed. Good hunting, gentlemen. The crews walked to their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness. Engines coughed to life one by one. 50 bombers, 500 men, all heading toward the same point on the map. Ross climbed through the rear hatch of Devil's Chariot and crawled back to his position. The tail section was cramped, barely enough room to move. He strapped himself in, tested the guns, checked the ammunition feed. The intercom crackled. Captain Morrison's voice calm as always. "Crew check. Call in." One by one, the crew responded. "Co-pilot, check." "Navigator, check." That was Bobby Hayes, steady as ever. "Bombardier, check." Eddie's voice cracked slightly. "Flight engineer, check." "Radio, check." "Ball turret, check." "Waist gunners, check." "Tail gunner, check." Morrison's voice again. "Gentlemen, this is mission number 13. I don't believe in luck. I believe in doing our jobs. We drop our bombs, we come home, same as always. Let's go to work." Yeet. The engines roared. Devil's Chariot shuddered and began to roll. 0730 hours. Takeoff. 50 bombers formed up over England. tight defensive boxes, each aircraft positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The theory was simple. Pack the bombers close enough together and their combined firepower would drive off enemy fighters. The reality was different. A direct hit on one aircraft often damaged those flying beside it. Shrapnel and debris had a way of finding the weakest points. Devil's Chariot held position number 7 in the second element. Not the best spot, not the worst. They crossed the North Sea at 8,000 feet, climbing steadily. By the time they reached the German coast, they were at 22,000 feet. By the time they approached Bremen, they'd be at 24,000. Ross watched England disappear behind them, watched the grey water below, thought about Willa May, wondered if she was awake yet back in Bayfield, wondered what she was doing, probably worrying about him. He'd written her a letter last night, sealed it in an envelope, left it on his bunk with instructions to mail it if he didn't come back. The letter said, "I love you. I'm sorry. Wait for me anyway." 10:45 hours. Approaching Bremen. The German coast appeared ahead. Industrial haze, cities, rivers snaking through farmland. Then the flak started. Black bursts filled the sky. Anti-aircraft shells exploding at precise altitudes calculated to intersect with bomber formations. The Germans had gotten very good at this. 3 years of practice. Devil's Chariot shuddered as shrapnel whistled past. Ross felt the impacts through the fuselage, metallic pings, some close, some closer. A B-17 in the formation ahead took a direct hit. The left wing folded. The aircraft rolled inverted and dropped from the sky like a stone. Ross counted 3 parachutes. 7 men didn't get out. The intercom came alive with fragments of conversation. "Flak at 10 o'clock. Stay in formation. Number 3 engine running hot." Captain Morrison's voice cut through. "Steady. We're almost at the IP." The initial point, where they'd start the bomb run. Fly straight and level for 6 minutes. No evasive maneuvers, just hold course while the flak tried to tear them apart. Ross gripped his guns and waited. Then he saw them. German fighters. Dozens of them. Climbing from below, diving from above. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, black crosses visible on their wings. They were coming for Devil's Chariot. "Bandits!" Ross shouted into the intercom. 6 o'clock low. Multiple fighters." Morrison's voice stayed calm. "Make 'em count, boys." The first Messerschmitt came in fast, tracers streaming. Ross pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate behind him and squeezed the triggers. His twin 50s roared to life. Spent brass casings tumbled around his knees. The smell of cordite filled the cramped compartment. The Messerschmitt broke off, rolling away into a dive. But there were more. Many more. 1,132 hours. Over the target, Devil's Chariot released its bombs. 4,000 pounds of high explosives tumbling toward the Bremen shipyards below. Eddie's voice cracked over the intercom. "Bombs away, bombs away." Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight home. The formation began its turn toward England. 200 miles of hostile airspace between them and safety. That was when Devil's Chariot's number 2 engine took a direct hit from flak. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Black smoke poured from the cowling. Captain Morrison's voice, still calm but with an edge now. "Feathering number 2. We're losing speed." A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was a death sentence. German fighter pilots watched for stragglers. A lone B-17 without the protection of massed defensive fire was easy prey. Ross saw them coming, a dozen Messerschmitts climbing from below, another group of Focke-Wulfs diving from above. Devil's Chariot was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds. The first Messerschmitt came in from the 6 o'clock low position. directly behind and beneath the bomber. Ross swung his guns and fired. Tracer rounds streaked toward the fighter. The German pilot broke off and rolled away. But there were more. The wolves attacked in pairs. One would draw the gunner's attention while the other lined up a killing shot. Ross swung from target to target. His ammunition belts fed smoothly, spent brass piled around his knees. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside Devil's Chariot was 43 degrees below zero. Ross wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still seeped through. His breath formed ice crystals on his oxygen mask. The machine guns grew hot from continuous firing while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. A Fokker-Wulf came in from the 4 o'clock position. Ross swung his guns and pressed the triggers. The fighter's wing disintegrated. It spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. He didn't have time to celebrate. Cannon rounds ripped through the tail section, 20mm shells punching through aluminum like paper. Ross felt something slam into his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his flight suit sleeves. The pain was immediate and intense, but his hands still worked. He could still grip the triggers. He kept firing. More impacts. The vertical stabilizer above him took multiple hits. Control cables snapped and whipped through the air. The tail section began vibrating violently. Something was very wrong with the aircraft. Ross glanced down at his parachute. Every airman wore one. The silk canopy packed into a canvas container strapped to his chest. If the bomber went down, the parachute was his only chance of survival. He saw the holes, multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded the fabric. His parachute was useless. If he had to bail out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attack continued. German fighters made pass after pass. Ross counted at least 15 of them circling the crippled bomber. Devil's Chariot was bleeding altitude and speed. The remaining engines strained to keep the aircraft airborne. The intercom was dead. Ross had no idea if anyone else was still alive. He was alone in the tail, shooting at an enemy that wouldn't stop coming. Another cannon round struck the bomber. This one hit something critical. Ross felt the aircraft lurch. A grinding sound echoed through the airframe. The vibration intensified until his teeth rattled. Then came a sound he would never forget, the shriek of tearing aluminum, the scream of structural failure. Devil's Chariot was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail section. Ross watched in horror as the front of the aircraft separated and fell away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, Captain Morrison with his daughter's picture, Bobby Hayes with his MIT education, Eddie Carlisle with his pregnant girlfriend waiting at home, all of them, all 9 men, tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. Ross was alone now, trapped in a severed tail section, wounded in both arms, his parachute destroyed, 24,000 feet above enemy territory, falling. The laws of physics offered no mercy. Terminal velocity for a human body is approximately 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster, much faster. Roscoe Thatcher had perhaps 90 seconds to live. The German fighters circled closer. They saw the tail section falling and moved in for a better look. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they were curious. Whatever their reason, they made a fatal mistake. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Ross grabbed his machine guns. The spinning tail section made aiming nearly impossible. The G-forces pressed him against his seat, then threw him toward the ceiling. His wounded arms screamed with pain. Blood sprayed across the interior. His parachute was destroyed. He was falling 4 miles to certain death, and he was still shooting. Tracers arced wildly through the sky as the tail section rotated. The German pilots scattered. They had never seen anything like this. A man in a falling coffin. firing back at them with everything he had. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke off and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail section was shattered, but Ross could see the ground growing larger through the gaps in the torn metal. Fields, forests, roads, the patchwork of German farmland rushing up to meet him, 90 seconds, maybe less. Ross Thatcher, farm boy from Bayfield, Wisconsin, kept his fingers on the triggers and fired into the sky until the trees reached up to take him. The tail section of Devil's Chariot spun through the sky like a leaf caught in a tornado. Ross slammed against the left wall, then the ceiling. Then the ammunition boxes. His broken arms bent at angles they were never designed to bend. Each impact brought fresh waves of agony. Blood filled his mouth. He'd bitten through his tongue. The metallic taste mixed with the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid leaking from severed lines. The world outside the torn fuselage was a blur. Sky, ground, sky, ground, spinning too fast to track. But the tail section wasn't falling straight down. The vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers were acting like crude wings, catching the air, creating drag. The physics were working in his favor, barely. Instead of plummeting at terminal velocity, the wreckage was gliding, tumbling, yes, spinning, yes, but descending at maybe 100 feet per second instead of 200. It was the difference between instant death and probable death. Ross chose probable. He pulled himself back to the guns. His right arm responded. His left arm hung useless, bone protruding through the sleeve of his flight suit. He wrapped his good hand around the right gun's grip and squeezed the trigger. The Browning roared. Tracers spiraled out into the void. A Messerschmitt flashed past. Too close. Ross swung the gun. Fired. Couldn't tell if he hit anything. Didn't matter. The German pilots were breaking off now, peeling away from the falling wreckage. They'd never seen a dead man fight back. The ground was rushing up fast. Ross could make out individual trees now, a frozen stream, a farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney, 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,000. The tail section clipped the top of a pine tree. Branches as thick as a man's arm snapped like matchsticks. The impact sent the wreckage cartwheeling sideways. Another tree, the vertical stabilizer, caught on the trunk and tore away with a shriek of rending metal. The tail section tumbled through the forest canopy. Each impact shed pieces. Aluminum skin framework. The left gun mount tore free and disappeared into the branches. Ross wrapped his good arm around the ammunition box and held on. The final impact came without warning. The tail section slammed into frozen ground at roughly 80 miles per hour. The entire structure compressed like an accordion. Ross's head struck the steel framework above him. His vision exploded into white light. He felt ribs crack, felt something tear loose inside his chest, then stillness. Total silence except for the creak of settling metal and the drip of leaking fuel. Ross opened his eyes. He was alive. The realization came slowly, pushing through layers of shock and pain. His body screamed at him from a dozen different places. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His right arm could lift a few inches. His left arm was a shattered mess of bone and torn flesh. Inventory of damage: both forearms broken, compound fractures, bone visible through skin, ribs shattered on the left side. Each breath brought stabbing pain. Head wound, something warm running down his face. He reached up with his good hand, felt torn flesh, felt something hard and white beneath. Skull. His skull was cracked open. He pulled his hand away. It came back red and glistening. The cold hit him next. 20 degrees here on the ground. His heated flight suit had stopped working. Blood was already freezing in his hair. Ross tried to call out. His voice came as a weak croak. No one would hear him. No one was coming. Except they were. Voices through the trees, German voices. Getting closer, Ross tried to reach for his sidearm. Standard issue .45 caliber pistol. Every airman carried one. His holster was empty. The gun had been torn away in the crash. He was unarmed, broken, bleeding out in a German forest. The soldiers emerged from the trees with rifles raised. Wehrmacht regulars, 5 of them. They surrounded the wreckage and stared at the American lying in the snow. One of them shouted something in German. Another ran back toward the road. An officer arrived 10 minutes later, Hauptmann rank insignia on his collar. He looked at Ross with the expression of a man examining a broken machine, calculating, assessing. The officer knelt beside Ross and examined his wounds, shook his head, said something to the soldiers. Ross didn't speak German, but he understood the tone. This one's dead already. Not worth the effort. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignored his screams as they moved his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. One soldier pointed at the parachute and laughed, said something to the others. They all looked at Ross differently then. This American had fallen from the sky without a parachute and survived. The officer made a decision, barked orders. 2 soldiers disappeared and returned with a wooden cart, the kind farmers used to haul firewood. They loaded Ross onto the cart like cargo. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical attention. His broken body lay on bare wood. The cart began moving. Every bump sent fresh agony through his ribs and fractured arms. The frozen road stretched ahead for what felt like hours. Ross drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was aware, he counted the trees passing overhead. When the pain became too much, he let the darkness take him. Sometimes he saw Eddie, the bombardier, standing in the snow beside the cart, smiling that sad smile. "I told you," Eddie said. "Tell them I wasn't scared." Ross tried to speak, tried to say he would, tried to say he was sorry, but Eddie was already gone. The cart delivered him to a German military facility. Ross couldn't identify what kind. A converted building, stone walls, concrete floors. They carried him inside and laid him on the floor in a hallway. Then they left. No doctor came, no medic, no one offered water or bandages or morphine. Ross lay on that concrete floor and watched the shadows move across the ceiling as day turned to dawn, to night. His wounds were infected by morning. The exposed brain tissue had swollen. Pus oozed from the tears in his scalp. His broken arms had turned purple and black. Gangrene was setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without antibiotics, the infection would spread to his blood. Without intervention, he had perhaps 48 hours to live. German guards walked past periodically. Some glanced at him with indifference, others with something that might have been pity, but none of them had the authority or the resources to help. American bombers had been destroying German cities for months. Medical supplies were scarce. Doctors were overwhelmed with German casualties. Enemy airmen ranked far below German soldiers and civilians on the priority list. Ross understood. He would have done the same. On the second day, a guard brought him water, held the canteen to his lips. Ross drank. The guard said nothing, just walked away. Small mercy. On the third day, they moved him again. Another cart, another journey over frozen roads. This time his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building somewhere in occupied territory where wounded Allied airmen were held until they recovered enough to be sent to permanent camps. The hospital was understaffed and undersupplied. German military doctors performed triage on incoming prisoners. Those with survivable wounds received treatment. Those deemed beyond saving were left to die. Ross's injuries placed him firmly in the second category. They left him on a cot in a corridor. He could hear moaning from other rooms, smell infection and gangrene and death. Then two men appeared, not German. Their uniforms were different, ragged, patched. They spoke to each other in a language Ross didn't recognize. Serbian, he would learn later. The older one knelt beside Ross's cot, examined his wounds with practiced efficiency, lifted Ross's eyelids, checked his pupils, pressed fingers against his neck to feel his pulse. The man turned to his companion and spoke rapidly. The younger one shook his head. They argued briefly. Then the older man looked directly at Ross. "You are badly hurt," he said in heavily accented English. "Very badly, but I think, maybe, we can help." Ross tried to speak, managed only a whisper. "Why?" The man smiled sadly. "Because we are doctors, and you are a patient. Is enough reason, yes?" Dr. Luka Petrovic was 45 years old, Serbian army surgeon, captured on the Eastern Front in 1941. He'd been pressed into service treating wounded prisoners of war because it freed German doctors for more important patients. His assistant was Dr. Nikola Jovanovic, 38, also Serbian, also captured, also forced to work in this understaffed hospital with inadequate equipment and almost no supplies. They took Ross to what passed for an operating room, a converted storage area, a single table, instruments designed for field operations, not delicate surgery. "We have local anesthesia," Dr. Petrovic explained. "Not enough for what we must do. You will feel pain, much pain, but if we do nothing, you die. You understand?" Ross understood. They began. The surgery lasted 7 hours. Dr. Petrovic worked on Ross's arms first, cleaning the infected tissue, removing bone fragments, setting the breaks with metal pins salvaged from God knows where. Wire stitches holding everything together. Ross drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was aware, the pain was beyond description. When he passed out, it was a mercy. The skull work came next. Dr. Petrovic worked with infinite patience, removing bone fragments embedded in brain tissue, cleaning the wound, fashioning a metal plate from a salvaged German helmet. He attached the plate with wire stitches, covered the exposed brain with what tissue he could salvage. His hands never shook. His focus never wavered. Dr. Jovanovic assisted, handing instruments, wiping blood, keeping Ross from moving when the pain made him thrash, hour after hour. When it was over, they splinted Ross's arms with wooden boards, wrapped everything in bandages torn from sheets, did everything possible with almost nothing available. Dr. Petrovic stood back and examined his work, wiped sweat from his forehead. "Now we wait," he said. 72 hours. Your body must fight infection. Your bones must begin to heal. There is nothing more we can do." Ross managed to speak. "Thank you." Dr. Petrovic shook his head. "Do not thank me yet. You may still die. And if you live," he gestured at Ross's ruined arms, "you will never be the same. Still better than dead. Perhaps. We will see." They moved Ross to a recovery area, a corner of a larger room where other wounded prisoners lay on cots. The fever came that night. Ross's temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills despite the sweat pouring from his skin. The Serbian doctors monitored him as closely as their limited resources allowed. They changed his bandages, forced water between his cracked lips, waited. Infection was the great killer. Dr. Petrovich had cleaned Ross's wounds as thoroughly as possible, but bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. His immune system was fighting a war inside his own body. The second night was worse. Ross slipped into delirium, called out for people who weren't there. "Willamay, I'm sorry."
Captain Morrison, sir, engines failing. Eddie, I'll tell them, I promise. I'm cold, so cold.
He relived the crash, saw the plane break apart, watched his crewmates fall, the spinning wreckage, the ground rushing up. Sometimes he was back in that spinning tail section, the world a blur around him. Dr. Petrovich sat with him through the worst of it, pressed cold cloths against his burning forehead, whispered encouragement that Ross probably couldn't hear. On the third morning, the fever broke. Ross opened his eyes, recognized his surroundings for the first time in days, saw Dr. Petrovich sitting beside the cot. "You live," the doctor said simply. "Feels like it. The infection, it is still there, but your body is winning. You are strong, like ox." Ross tried to smile. It hurt. Dr. Petrovich examined his wounds, found the first signs of healing. The tissue around the skull plate was beginning to close. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit together. "You will live," he said again. "Recovery will take months, maybe years. The damage is extensive, but you will live." That night, while Ross slept fitfully, Dr. Petrovich sat at a small table in the corner of the room, found a scrap of paper, a pencil stub. He wrote in careful English, forming each letter slowly. "To the family of Sergeant Roscoe Thatcher, Bayfield, Wisconsin, your son fell from the sky. We put him back together with wire and salvaged metal. He should have died a dozen times. He did not. He is strong, like the mountains of my homeland, like the men who will not break no matter what breaks around them. I have a son, somewhere in Yugoslavia. I do not know if he lives, but if someone saved him the way I saved your boy, I would die grateful. Tell him he lived for a reason. Tell him to find it. Dr. Luka Petrovich, Serbian Army Medical Corps prisoner." He folded the paper carefully, walked to Ross's cot. The young American was sleeping, his breathing steady for the first time in days. Dr. Petrovich lifted the corner of Ross's uniform jacket, found the inside pocket, the one over his heart. He tucked the letter inside. Ross would not find it for 62 years. Word spread through the hospital. The American who fell 4 miles without a parachute, the tail gunner who kept shooting as his bomber disintegrated around him, the man who should have died a dozen times but refused to stop breathing. German guards came to look at him. Other prisoners asked to hear his story. Even the hospital administrators seemed impressed. 6 weeks later, Ross could walk again. His arms remained in splints. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. His ribs ached with every breath. But he was mobile. He was conscious. He was ready for transfer. Before he left, Dr. Petrovich came to say goodbye.
"You remember what I told you," the doctor said. "You lived for a reason. Find it." Ross nodded. "I don't even know your name, your real name." "Names do not matter. Only this. Keep living. Live for those who could not." They shook hands. Ross tried to say thank you. The words weren't enough. Would never be enough. Dr. Petrovich seemed to understand. "Go. Live well. That is all the thanks I need." Ross never saw him again.
Stalag, Luft 4, Pomerania. The camp sat in the flat farmland of eastern Germany, barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, Wooden barracks that offered little protection against the brutal winter. Thousands of Allied airmen filled the compound. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, men who'd been shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Ross found a strange community behind the wire. Prisoners organized themselves into units, maintained military discipline, created libraries from donated books, held classes, built secret radios to monitor BBC broadcasts. They also planned escapes that rarely succeeded. On his third day, another prisoner approached him. Thin, like everyone else, but there was something familiar about his face. Thatcher, Ross Thatcher. Ross turned, stared. Bobby Hayes, the navigator from Devil's Chariot. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, MIT graduate, steady hands, soft-spoken. They grabbed each other, two survivors of a crew that shouldn't have had any. "I thought you were dead," Bobby said. "I saw the plane break apart. Saw you in the tail section. I bailed out before. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." "Don't be, you did the right thing." "The others?" Ross shook his head. "All gone. Morrison, Eddie, everyone." Bobby closed his eyes. Eddie kept talking about his girl, the baby. "I know. Did you see?" "I saw them fall," Ross said quietly, "but that's all. It was fast." It was a lie, a small mercy. Ross had seen the front section tumbling, had imagined what those final seconds must have been like. But Bobby didn't need to know that. They stood in silence for a moment. "How did you survive?" Bobby finally asked. "The tail section fell like a glider, crashed in a forest. Germans found me. Serbian doctors patched me up." Bobby stared at him. "You fell from 24,000 feet without a parachute. Yeah, that's impossible. I know." The camp provided minimal rations, thin soup, black bread, occasionally potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages supplemented the diet when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Ross had weighed 150 pounds when Devil's Chariot took off. By spring of 1944, he weighed 120. His body continued healing, his arms regained function, though they would never be as strong as before. The bones had fused at wrong angles. Simple tasks, buttoning a shirt, holding a spoon, required concentration. The headaches from his skull injury became less frequent, but never stopped completely. Cold weather made them worse. The metal plate conducted temperature directly to his brain. The nightmares came every night. Different variations of the same dream. The plane breaking apart. The ground rushing up. Eddie smiling sadly. Captain Morrison clutching his daughter's picture. Then came summer and the hell ship. German authorities decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel was an aging freighter, never designed to carry human cargo. Guards forced the prisoners into the hold below deck, a dark metal cavern with no ventilation, no sanitation, and no space to move. Ross descended into that hold with 200 other men, Bobby Hayes beside him. The hatch closed above them. The ship began to move, and the nightmare began. The hold was completely dark. Men could not see their own hands. They could only hear. Groaning, coughing, retching. Men suffering from dysentery who could not reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. The stench became unbearable within hours. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Men went mad from the darkness and the smell and the constant rolling of the ship. Ross survived by counting, counted seconds, counted minutes, counted heartbeats, focused on the numbers instead of the horror around him. Bobby stayed close. They took turns, keeping each other awake. Talking, anything to stay human. "Tell me about Bayfield," Bobby would say. And Ross would describe the farm, the lake. Willamay, the eagle that circled overhead. The smell of hay in summer, normal things, things that seemed impossibly distant. "We're going to see it again," Bobby said. "The war's almost over. We just have to hold on." Ross wanted to believe him. When the hatch finally opened, Ross climbed out into grey daylight with eyes that had forgotten how to see. His clothes were soaked with filth. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. Bobby emerged behind him, collapsed on the deck. Ross pulled him up. "Still alive?" Bobby asked. "Still alive." They'd survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. They'd survived crude surgery and raging infection. They'd survived 4 days in hell. They would survive this too. The hell ship delivered its cargo to another camp. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, more waiting for a war that seemed like it might never end. But Ross had learned something in that hold, something important. He could endure anything, absolutely anything, as long as he refused to quit. That knowledge would carry him through what came next, because the worst was still ahead. Winter came early to eastern Germany in 1945. By January, the snow lay 3 feet deep across the Pomeranian plains. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero, the kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. Inside Stalag Luft 4, the prisoners could hear something new: artillery, distant but growing closer. Soviet guns pounding German positions from the east. The Red Army was advancing, fast. The guards grew nervous, whispered among themselves, checked their weapons more frequently, scanned the eastern horizon like men watching for a storm they couldn't outrun. Ross knew what it meant. He'd been a prisoner for 14 months, long enough to read the signs, long enough to understand that desperate men made desperate decisions. On the night of February 5th, the compound loudspeakers crackled to life. All prisoners would evacuate at dawn, march west on foot. No exceptions. Refusal meant execution. The barracks erupted in conversation. Some men thought it was good news. Liberation was coming. The Germans were running. This was almost over. Ross knew better. He weighed 93 pounds now. His arms had healed crooked, the bones fused at wrong angles from that crude surgery. The metal plate in his skull conducted the winter cold directly into his brain, causing migraines that could last for days. And now they wanted him to walk across Germany in the coldest winter in decades. He did the math. 600 miles to the Allied lines, maybe more. So, through enemy territory, no food, no shelter, no medical care. It was a death sentence in slow motion. But the alternative was a bullet. Ross made his choice, the same way he'd made every choice since Devil's Chariot broke apart beneath him. He would take one more step, then one more after that. He would walk until he couldn't walk anymore. And then he would walk anyway. February 6, 1945. The march begins. The column formed up in the pre-dawn darkness. Thousands of Allied airmen standing in the snow. American, British, Canadian, Australian, men from every corner of the Alliance. Most wore only the clothes they'd been captured in. Some had winter coats scrounged from Red Cross packages. Many had no gloves, no proper boots, nothing but thin uniforms against the killing cold. Ross stood in formation with Bobby Hayes beside him, 2 survivors of Devil's Chariot. About to test whether they could survive one more impossible thing, the guards marched them out at dawn, west toward the sound of distant fighting, away from the approaching Red Army, deeper into a Germany that was collapsing from both sides. The first day, they covered 15 miles. Men began falling behind by afternoon. The guards shot them, left the bodies in the snow, kept the column moving. Ross learned the rhythm quickly. Don't think about tomorrow. Don't think about the destination. Think about the next 100 steps. Count them. 1, 2, 3, up to 100. Then rest for 10 seconds. Then count again. 100 steps at a time. Nothing beyond that. It worked. His body moved on autopilot. Left foot, right foot, repeat. The cold was worse than anything he'd experienced at altitude. This cold came from below. Rose through his boots, climbed his legs, settled into his bones. His hands went numb by noon, his feet by evening. The metal plate in his skull felt like ice pressed directly against his brain, but he kept walking. That night they slept in a barn. 200 men packed into a space meant for livestock. The floor was covered in frozen manure. The walls let in the wind. Ross found a corner and sat with his back against the wood. Bobby sat beside him. "You still with me?" Bobby asked. "Still here?" "Good, because I'm not doing this alone." Ross closed his eyes, tried to sleep, couldn't. Every time he drifted off, he was back in the tail section, the spinning wreckage, the ground rushing up. So he stayed awake and counted his heartbeats instead. Week 1. The column moved west through the frozen landscape, 15 miles a day, sometimes 20 if the guards were feeling ambitious. They slept in barns when they could find them, in ditches when they couldn't, huddled together for warmth, woke with frost on their eyelashes and ice in their hair. The rations were nothing. A slice of black bread in the morning, thin soup at night if they were lucky, sometimes raw potatoes stolen from fields. Sometimes nothing. Men died every day. Pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that turned to gangrene, simple exhaustion. The guards didn't bury them, just pulled the bodies to the side of the road and kept moving. Ross watched it happen, watched men stronger than him collapse, watched men better fed than him give up. He couldn't understand it at first. Then he realized they'd lost hope. Hope that the war would end. Hope.
Hope that they'd see home again. Hope that any of this meant anything. Ross had lost hope a long time ago. Lost it somewhere between the surgery and the hell ship. Lost it in that concrete hallway where the Germans left him to die. But he'd found something else, something harder, something that didn't need hope to function. Stubbornness, pure, pig-headed refusal to quit. He'd survived falling 4 miles from the sky. He'd survived having his skull cut open with improvised tools.
He'd survived 4 days in a ship's hold, breathing air thick with human waste. He wasn't going to die on a frozen road in Germany. Not after all that. So he walked. Bobby walked beside him. They didn't talk much. Talking took energy, but they stayed together. 2 parts of a crew that used to be 10. Week 4. The column had covered 200 miles, lost 300 men. Ross's body was shutting down. He could feel it happening, systems failing one by one. His feet were masses of frostbite, black toes, cracked skin. Every step felt like walking on broken glass. His ribs, never properly healed from the crash, sent spikes of pain through his chest with each breath. His arms, crooked and weak, hung useless at his sides. He couldn't help other men, couldn't carry anything, could barely keep himself upright. The typhus was spreading through the column. Men developed fevers, collapsed mid-step, died within hours. Ross felt the fever starting. A warmth in his chest that didn't come from the cold, a fog in his mind that didn't come from exhaustion. He knew what it meant. His body was giving up, surrendering to the infections that had been waiting since the crash, the bacteria that Dr. Petrovich had fought off with improvised surgery and sheer will. They were back. And this time, there was no doctor, no surgery, no fighting them off. Ross had a choice. He could stop walking, sit down in the snow, let it happen. No one would blame him. He'd done enough, survived longer than anyone had the right to expect. Or he could take one more step, then another, then another. He thought about Willa May. Wondered if she still waited, wondered if she'd moved on. Wondered if the letter he'd written before the Bremen mission had ever reached her. He thought about his mother, alone on the farm, waiting for news that might never come. He thought about Captain Morrison and Eddie and Bobby Hayes and the 8 other men who'd died when Devil's Chariot broke apart. No, not Bobby. Bobby was still here, still walking beside him. "You okay?" Bobby asked. "No, me neither. Keep walking anyway." Yeah, they didn't get a choice about whether to keep going. Morrison and Eddie didn't get that choice. They got death and darkness and a 4-mile fall. But Ross and Bobby did get a choice, so they chose left foot, right foot. Count to 100, rest 10 seconds, repeat. The fever raged through Ross. He was walking in a dream now, half-conscious, hallucinating. Sometimes he was back on the farm in Bayfield, carrying hay to the barn, his father calling from across the field. Sometimes he was back in that spinning wreckage, trying to aim his guns at fighters that wouldn't stop coming. Sometimes he was just walking, one foot in front of the other. Forever. Week 8, March, turned to April. The column had covered 400 miles. Half the prisoners who'd started the march were dead. The survivors looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, skeletal, moving only because stopping meant dying. Ross had stopped counting steps, stopped counting anything. He just walked. His mind had retreated somewhere deep inside, a place where the cold couldn't reach, where the pain couldn't touch him. His body moved on its own, muscle memory, reflex, something beyond conscious thought. Bobby was still beside him, barely. The navigator's MIT education didn't help with frostbite or starvation, but he was still walking. Other prisoners watched them with a mixture of awe and horror. These 2 scarecrows. These walking corpses. Still putting one foot in front of the other when men twice their size had given up. One of the guards pulled Ross aside one evening. An older Wehrmacht sergeant looked at him with something that might have been respect. "You should be dead," he said in broken English. Ross just stared at him. "I have seen many prisoners, many marches. You are the strongest." Ross found his voice. Hadn't spoken in days. Not strong, just stubborn. The guard almost smiled. Perhaps is the same thing. April 26th, 1945. Liberation. The column had covered 580 miles when the American tanks appeared. Sherman tanks, olive drab with white stars, the most beautiful thing Ross had ever seen. The German guards threw down their weapons, raised their hands. It was over. American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division swarmed the column. Medics, officers, men staring in shock at the walking skeletons in tattered uniforms. "Jesus Christ," one medic whispered. "What did they do to you?" Ross tried to answer. His legs buckled. He felt strong hands catch him before he hit the ground. Beside him, Bobby Hayes collapsed into the snow. Then darkness. Ross woke in a field hospital. Clean sheets, real beds, the smell of antiseptic instead of gangrene. A nurse stood beside his cot. American. She smiled when she saw his eyes open. "Welcome back, Sergeant." Ross tried to sit up. Couldn't. His body wouldn't respond. "Easy. You've been out for 2 days. You're severely malnourished, dehydrated, multiple infections. The doctors are amazed you're alive." In the cot beside him, Bobby Hayes was also awake, also hooked to IV tubes, also looking like a skeleton wrapped in skin. "Still here?" Bobby asked weakly. "Still here. Told you we'd make it." "You were right." Over the next week, Army investigators interviewed them both, verified their stories, cross-referenced them with German records and surviving crew members. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had bailed out of Devil's Chariot before the plane broke apart. He'd spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. His testimony confirmed Ross's account of what happened that November morning over Bremen. The investigators brought photographs, aerial reconnaissance of the crash site, wreckage scattered across a German forest, the tail section identifiable among the debris. Sergeant Thatcher, one officer said, "Our records show only 3 Allied airmen in the entire war survived falls of over 20,000 feet without functional parachutes. You're one of them." Ross didn't know what to say to that. "You're a genuine miracle, so don't feel like one." The investigators documented everything. Awards were processed. 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds sustained in combat, Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for aerial achievements, European Theatre Medal, Good Conduct Medal, Honourable Discharge December 1st, 1945. Bobby Hayes received similar commendations. They processed out together, 2 survivors of a 10-man crew. "What will you do?" Bobby asked as they waited for their transport home. "Go back to Bayfield, marry my girl, farm some land."
Try to forget. Will you? Forget? Yeah. Ross shook his head. No, but I'll try anyway. They shook hands one last time. Take care of yourself, Ross. You too, Bobby. They never saw each other again. December 1st, 1945, Bayfield, Wisconsin. The train pulled into the station on a grey December afternoon. Ross stood on the platform with his duffel bag, discharge papers in his pocket, medals in a box he'd probably never open. He weighed 110 pounds, still underweight, still recovering. The doctors said he'd never fully recover. The damage was too extensive. His mother was there, older than he remembered, greyer. She took one look at him and started crying. They didn't speak, just held each other while the other passengers moved around them. Willa May was waiting at the farm. She'd gotten his letter, the one he wrote the night before Bremen. She'd waited. She took one look at his crooked arms and the scar on his head where the metal plate showed beneath the skin, and she said, "We're getting married in the spring." Not a question, a statement. Ross just nodded. They married in April 1946, built a life on a small farm outside Bayfield, had children, worked the land, watched the seasons change, 9 children over the years. A farmhouse that was always full of noise and laughter and the smell of Willa May's cooking. Ross never talked about the war, not to Willa May, not to his children, not to the reporters who occasionally showed up wanting to interview the man who fell from the sky. He never told anyone about Eddie's last words, about the promise he couldn't keep because Eddie never made it home to tell his pregnant girlfriend anything. Some debts you carry forever. He'd give the reporters nothing. Just a polite refusal and a closed door. The nightmares continued every night for 60 years. Waking up screaming, the plane breaking apart, the spinning, the ground rushing up, always that moment of falling. Willa May would hold him until the shaking stopped, never asked questions, just held him. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak. His ribs ached when storms approached. But he lived, raised 9 children, buried his mother, watched his grandchildren grow, outlived most of his fellow prisoners, Stov, nearly all of his fellow crewmen. Bobby Hayes died in 1989. Heart attack. Ross read about it in the veterans' newsletter, didn't go to the funeral, couldn't bring himself to face that part of his past. 2007, Bayfield, Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They chose Ross as the first recipient. The ceremony brought journalists, historians, people who wanted to know about the tail gunner who kept shooting all the way down. Ross was 82 years old, still thin, still marked by the scars of that November day 64 years earlier. A reporter asked him, "How did you survive?" Ross thought about it, really thought about it. "I didn't do anything special," he said finally. "I just refused to quit. That's not heroism, that's stubbornness. But you kept fighting, even while falling." What else was I going to do? Give up? 8 men died on my plane. Thousands died on that march. I didn't have the right to give up. Do you have any message for young people today? Ross looked directly at the camera. Life will break you, that's guaranteed, but you get to choose whether you stay broken. I chose not to. That's all. 2008. The town of Bayfield named a street after him. Roscoe Thatcher Way, a small road near the lake where he used to walk with Willa May.
Ross stood at the dedication ceremony, said nothing, just shook hands and nodded. He didn't need speeches, didn't need recognition. He'd done what needed doing. That was enough. March 18th, 2014, Roscoe. Thatcher died in his sleep at 3 in the morning. Willa May was holding his hand. She'd been holding it for 68 years. Wasn't about to stop now. The children came, all 9 of them, middle-aged now, with children and grandchildren of their own. They filled the farmhouse. His youngest daughter asked, "Mum, what was he like before the war?" Willa May smiled. The same, stubborn, quiet. Wouldn't quit if you paid him to. Did he ever talk about it? What happened? Once, just once, the night before we married. The room went silent. He said, "I fell 4 miles, lived when I should have died, walked 600 miles when my body wanted to quit. You know what I learned?" "What?" she'd asked him. "That I didn't survive all that just to waste it. I'm going to build something. With you, a life that matters, not because it's heroic, because it's good." Willa May looked around at her children, her grandchildren, 23 of them, all alive because Ross Thatcher had refused to die. "He did exactly what he promised," she said, "built something good." The funeral was 3 days later. Military honours, flag-draped coffin, 21 guns fired into the grey March sky, the same grey sky he'd fallen through 70 years earlier. His 9 children stood in a line, their children behind them. 3 generations. The oldest grandson, Marcus, 32, history teacher, stepped forward, unfolded a piece of paper. "My grandfather never talked about being a hero," he read. "Never wanted parades, never wanted recognition. But I found something he wrote. Just once. In a letter to my grandmother, he said, 'I kept shooting all the way down because I figured if I was going to die anyway, I might as well die doing my job. Turned out I didn't die, so I kept doing my job every day for the rest of my life. That's all any of us can do.'" Marcus folded the paper. He did his job for 89 years, and now his watch is ended. They lowered the coffin into Wisconsin earth. The same earth Ross had worked for decades, the same earth he'd dreamed about while walking 600 miles through German snow. He was home. 6 months later, Marcus Thatcher stood in his grandfather's attic, sorting through boxes of old belongings. His grandmother had asked him to organize things, decide what to keep, what to donate. He found the old uniform in a trunk. Mothballs and memories. The dog tags were there, tarnished but readable. Thatcher, Roscoe Staff Sergeant. Army Air Forces. Marcus held them in his hand, felt the weight of them, the history. He reached into the uniform jacket pocket, felt paper. He pulled out a yellowed envelope. The paper was brittle, the edges torn. Inside a letter, written in shaky handwriting, broken English. Marcus read it slowly. "To the family of Sergeant Roscoe Thatcher, Bayfield, Wisconsin, your son fell from the sky. We put him back together with wire and salvaged metal. He should have died a dozen times. He did not. He is strong, like the mountains of my homeland, like the men who will not break no matter what breaks around them. I have a son, somewhere in Yugoslavia. I do not know if he lives, But if someone saved him the way I saved your boy, I would die grateful. Tell him he lived for a reason. Tell him to find it." Dr. Luka Petrovich, Serbian Army Medical Corps prisoner Marcus, read it twice, then a third time. He walked downstairs, found his grandmother in the kitchen, Willa May, 91 years old now, still sharp as a tack. "Grandma, did you know about this?" He handed her the letter. She read it. Tears filled her eyes.
"He never told me," she whispered. 70 years, he never said. Why not? Because that's who he was. Received miracles, never spoke of them, just lived his life in gratitude. Marcus looked at the letter, at the careful handwriting of a man who'd saved an enemy's life for no reason, except it was the right thing to do. "What should we do with it?" Willa May smiled. "Frame it. Put it in the Veterans Memorial, next to his medals.
Let people know that sometimes the enemy shows you what it means to be human." They framed the letter, hung it in the Bayfield Veterans Memorial Hall, next to Ross's medals, next to a photograph of Devil's Chariot, next to the street sign, Roscoe Thatcher Way. The memorial stands in Bayfield's town square, black granite, simple. 8 names carved on the left side: Devil's Chariot Crew, November 29th, 1943, Captain Frank Morrison, Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, Lieutenant Edward Carlisle, Sergeant Michael O'Reilly, Sergeant Anthony Russo, Sergeant William Jackson, Sergeant Richard Davis, Sergeant Henry Peterson. On the right side, one name, Staff, Sergeant Roscoe Thatcher. November 1924 to March 2014, he kept shooting all the way down. Below that, in smaller letters, one of 3 men in World War II to survive a fall over 20,000 feet without a parachute. Fresh flowers sit at the base. They're always fresh. The children take turns, the grandchildren, now the great-grandchildren. A young girl, 7 years old, red hair like her great-great-grandmother, kneels to place new daisies, reads the inscription aloud, stumbling over the big words. "Grandma says he was just stubborn," she tells her mother. Her mother smiles. "That's exactly right." Above them, a contrail cuts across the blue sky, a passenger jet at 35,000 feet. The little girl watches it pass, doesn't know that 70 years ago, her great-great-grandfather fell from a height like that. Kept shooting, kept living, kept going, all the way home.